Hi there, it is great to have you with us if you're watching live, and likewise if you're listening back to the audio podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Today is Monday, the 9th of November when we're recording. It's just been quite a chaotic week with world global politics and everything. But what I'm really excited to do today is talk about lots of things to do with the future. And there's one organisation that keeps coming up time and time again in my conversations about doing incredible things, not just during COVID, but also in a period before as well. So I'm delighted today to be joined by Crispin Woodhead, who's the Chief Exec of the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. Crispin, great to have you with us.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for asking me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So one thing I do at the beginning of all of these is to be, from my side, slightly lazy and not have to introduce you properly, but I think it's really fascinating to hear your answer on this, which is, how would you define yourself?
An undiscovered imposter, without question. And the reason I'd say that is because I'm very lucky, I suppose you could put it that way, to have done many different things before I ended up in my job at the OAE. It's true that I did run an orchestra before that. I set up Archangelo with an old schoolmate of mine called Johnny Cohen. Before that, I was a teacher and I set up websites, which still run. And I was an agent for opera singers and conductors. I've even done a stint as an undertaker. So I've done lots of different things. And never in my wildest dreams did I think I would end up working with an orchestra that used to impress me greatly when it hit the airwaves in the late 80s when I was an A-level student and I heard their recordings. So it's a bit of a journey and a big surprise.
That is, yeah, quite an incredible journey. It's an eclectic, but I imagine all those different experiences really help you with your job. And I remember,
particularly being an undertaker.
Yeah, certainly. I imagine some unusual settings for that to come in handy. Dark sense of humour, maybe, and that sort of thing. But from what you were saying, that the Orchestra Age of Enlightenment really impressed you when you were an A-level student, how would you also define the OAE? Because they're quite a unique entity.
Well, I mean, they're an amazing bunch of people. And I suppose the things that people hold on to, when you talk about the OAE, they think of the period instrument tradition, the movement that seeks to reproduce that sound world that the composer might have expected when the work had been first written. I suppose the OAE is also well known for being player-led, so that they choose their destiny. They decide what they're going to play and who they're going to play it with, and very often how they're going to play it. So there's that fantastic sort of democratic centre to it all, which is a really fascinating reality. And it's a daily ethos. It's not something that you check in on every month. And working with them in my role is a huge privilege. I would probably, above all, I would describe the orchestra as adventurers. It's people who, even with the most familiar repertoire, and I by the way, I realise that most musicians will probably hear this and think, I'm like that. And sure enough, you very probably are. But as an ensemble, their approach is very much not to get the score out with their old markings and then just do that again. It's not to try and repeat something they've done before, either because they want to do new repertoire or because they want to do the same repertoire, but look upon it as if it's been freshly minted with a fresh perspective. And I suppose that spirit of adventure is the thing that really grabs me. I think that's an enormous amount of fun.
Very much so, and that leads wonderfully into my next section. So thank you so much for setting up the segue. You do so much of reimagining formats as well as just presenting concerts in a traditional element of there being a stage and an audience. You've reimagined with your Bart the Universe and everything. What, say, for example, a religious service would be secularly, so we're having not just the music of cantatas, but also pairing it with educational speakers and scientists. Why is it you keep pushing forward and doing this adventuring as part of OAE?
Well, it's exactly the right question. I think there are two reasons. The first is that I think everybody is looking for the fresh perspective. Everyone's trying to find something that enlivens the art form. And of course, in many arts, what you produce is new. If you're a sculptor, you have your new sculpture, and people look at that. But whilst we do, as an OAE, we do curate and commission new work, we nonetheless spend a lot of time looking after an established canon. And one of the things that established repertoire, I think established material, well-known material in any art form, tends to attract is a connotation, an expectation. You could go so far as to say maybe even an inhibition or a prejudice about how it should be treated, how it should be received. And I think that one of the things that the OAE is always looking forward to is some kind of new experience, and that's true of many organizations. The reasons why this might be such a profound instinct for the OAE, I think, come to the second major point, and that is that in trying to revisit the sound world, you can either just sort of say, well, we've got the gear, and we've read Leopold Mozart, we know how to do this, and so it will all just happen. But there's much more in the challenge of recreating the original experience than that. In a way, the machinery is really a small detail. The people that you are trying to play for today are not the same as the ones who attended Handel's theatres or the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, or were at that first performance of the Emperor Concerto. They're not. They're different. They're in a different setting. They don't know anything of the patronage or the local culture or the trends and movements around them. Now, obviously, that's just the way it is, and each history has its own mores. But if you want to try and capture something of context, of provenance, say, for example, the cantatas, you mentioned the Bach Universe and Everything program. Well, you'll struggle to find many Lutheran pietist Christians knocking about. They don't grow on trees. I'm not saying they're an endangered species, but fashions change, and you won't find a congregation of such faithful these days. So does that mean that the original context of their cantatas is unavailable to us? No, of course you can do them in a church service, but still not quite the same. And also, Leipzig was a very unusual place in the 1720s. It was a correspondence point. If you look at the soil, you could guess hundreds of years before that civilization was the venue for that art. You could guess that it was going to have that, plus many other things, like being one of the first places to have street lighting or have a great university, or advances in the sciences to be a trading center. You'd expect all of those things in that place. And I think the people who went to that building and heard those cantatas belonged to a milieu, belonged to a society and a climate which is as rich in influence and as energies as any other, as ours. And I think if you were going to watch, for example, the Biden-Trump broadcasts at the moment, and then read the tweets, you'd only understand them halfway if you didn't really have a sense of what else was going on. And that's a challenge to really getting the cantatas. We all think they're beautiful, and we can all see why they're marvelous constructions. But the inner truth and the connection with that maybe is assisted by other things. So if you say, well, we normally perform in a concert hall, why so? Because that's not true, is it? Because they were in a church, and the other works I've mentioned, they were in other locations. So the Handelian was in different theatres. Some things were done by dint of necessity in domestic circumstances. Others had patronage and had more august settings. The point I want to make here is that those people who came together and therefore were in this particular setting for the cantatas in a church, there were certain things they resonated with. And I think that it is possible by either location or by other aspects of context to get people to resonate in the same way. I used to quip at the start of the Bach Universe and Everything thing that the challenge was that if you put the people who went to Leipzig in the 1720s through an MRI scanner, you'd find the same patterns. Well, the target would be, the ambition would be that in a modern audience hearing the same repertoire in the modern context and how we present it, that we stimulate the same parts of the brain, we question the same parts of the whole person. And I think that the translation of metaphysics to physics, of having a guest scientist alongside the science, bringing in something which simulated the Florilegium Portense, the polyphony, bringing in the other elements, some spoken word. I think we've had a good crack at that. And I think that's enriching. And I suppose when it comes back to the variety of circumstance, the reason why we want to look at different settings for these works is because we're trying to achieve something more than just a viable acoustic environment where you can get people on seats and make enough money at the door. There has to be more to it than that. And I think if you're interested in the music, then the clues are there. The clues are in the aspiration of the people who created those scores and their relationship with community. And those clues indicate avenues we might explore now, which are new to the works, but actually strangely coherent with their inception. So that's the story of Bach Universe and Everything. It's to get people's brains to work and to fire off in different ways. And I would argue that if someone is thinking about the origins of galaxies, or maybe how you get a liquid crystal contact lens to oscillate quickly enough for it to refract so responsively to the eye so that it can be a dynamic lens. I think if you've got scientists talking about that alongside this great music, which may be about Licht and Sicht, I think you are hitting the spot that maybe a good sermon in Leipzig did alongside the first hearing. So long answer, but there it is. That's what I think, and that's what we've been doing.
It's a very good answer. And I think what's really fascinating is that you're saying it's trying to recreate the resulting feeling and experience rather than identically replicating what was happening before. So it is that stimulus thing.
Yeah,
do you
that's
think
exactly
that's
it.
one of the reasons why you've been so keen on pushing digital at the OAE? And sort of, we're going to ignore COVID entirely if we can for the next 5 minutes. But the OAE was really
Handel would
big
be
on...
all over YouTube. Sorry, I interrupted, but Handel would be all over YouTube. He'd be there like a shot.
Is that why the OAE has grown to, was it 79,000 subscribers on YouTube, with some videos with 2.8 million views, which is totally beyond, I think, most organisations in classical music. Is that why you've sort of followed in his theoretical footsteps?
Well, I mean, every composer's ever written a note has wanted an audience. I think that, yes, of course. I mean, it's the water we swim in these days, and I think there was a sort of, plonk. The internet was invented, and then its capacity to translate data across continents and to communicate at high speed. As soon as we went off those wretched 48K modems where you saw a little picture just gradually descend down the screen, now we can whip things around in 4K in the blink of an eye. That's asked a very difficult question of the arts. The phonographic industry have felt it for a long time, of course, and we've lived with it for a while, but I don't think we've completely articulated the answer yet. What do we do about digital? What do we do about the internet? Where, if someone puts something online, it just gets expunged. I mean, it's very easy to forget, but, the sort of, the Spotify culture has emerged from something which was a little less legitimate, where there was peer-to-peer file sharing. I have friends who use things like LimeWire, for example, and were able to get hold of all kinds of tracks without paying for them. And so this weird kind of mass culture of engaging in digital has emerged from a kind of Wild West. And we're still not articulating the complete answer. I'm an optimist, and I think that the fabulous platform that there is for digital still has much more to offer. The platform of digital has a lot more to offer, particularly for perform music. But of course, we need to be cognizant of two really crucial facts. And the first is that the great tradition, the overwhelming tradition, is live, it's personal, it's about human contact, and it's about the integrity of performance. Everybody gets that. It doesn't matter who you're into. It doesn't matter if you like the Pet Shop Boys. I'm showing my age, but they do really great shows, and they are par excellence in recording. So, to take them as an example, or Snoop Dogg, or whatever folks you vote, you still get something out of seeing these people unplugged, about being live, that human context. That's rule number one. So we've got to make digital acknowledge some kind of personal reality that rewards the people who happen to log on. Just straight on, flat on view, this two-dimensional experience online doesn't really cut it. It's boring. I switch off. And you're in competition with Breaking Bad, so you have to try harder. And the second thing, of course, is monetization. And, and that is not a new question. The value of art and how much artists should be rewarded and how much they should be paid has been going on for bloody years. I mean, if you read Monteverdi's letters, you know perfectly well that earning an honest crust as a musician is not a straightforward business, and it's full of strife and conflict. And we have that too. We just have a kind of cyber patron that is pervious to logic, but we have to find the right formula, or else it doesn't work. So I think it's fascinating. I think it's very interesting. I don't feel sorry for myself. I don't think that musicians should. I think they should feel a bit like Handel, thinking, this is getting a bit tricky. Let's try this then. And we should crack on and be courageous and optimistic and find new things. Because the one thing I'm sure of is that if we rise to the level of ambition and genius that people like Bach and Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven had when they approached their scores, we'll do fine. We'll do fine. We'll do fine. There's no limit to inspiration and artistry if appropriately applied. We're easily equipped to find that formula that works with our new cyber patrons. So I'm optimistic and enjoying the journey.
Very true. And I loved your analogy of it being the Wild West originally that sort of led into Spotify and things like LimeWire and Napster, and how Napster also then influenced Facebook and all these different things. Thinking sort of back to the word enlightenment in the Orchestra of Age of Enlightenment, that was a period of rapid change, of rethinking of the world and how it worked and how we communicated. And going back a little bit before that period, the Reformation and all the things that were done around then, you mentioned Lutheranism, I think that we don't really understand just how revolutionary a time we live in compared to then. And looking at how the Wittenberg printing press was created, and this huge change in how the world was understood. A new god appeared in effect. We had Lutheranism and Calvinism came, iconoclasm and rioting and wars and all these different things. And it was incredibly revolutionary because it almost democratized how information was passed between people. And prior to the printing press, you'd only need to, in essence, own your own monastery to get your book published to send to someone else, which is quite a big gatekeeper. Do you think, I know enlightenment for my research this week may not be the suitable term, but do you think we're living through a new golden age in that same way, where we're living through a revolutionary period where we now have the tools that are democratized to communicate on a large scale in a way that was being held behind by gatekeepers in a similar way to the Reformation and then potentially also then the Enlightenment?
Simple question. I mean, the first question is, did the golden age ever exist? And of course, it probably didn't. It's always idealized. And there have always been optimists in these periods of phenomenal social advancement, and those optimists have, in part, been, if they've held to it, have seen things that have rewarded their aspirations. But then there have been many optimists who've been dashed. So I'm not putting it down on things, but it is a fact that if you were riding the crest of a rational wave, that everything will find itself and it'll all be good, and the rational order will to a greater or lesser extent resolve social issues, manage government, bring people to harmony, quell wars, refine to a point of ideal perfection the human state. Well, you got a bit of a disappointment at the end of the 18th century, and then if you hadn't got the message in Robespierre, for example, then Napoleon came along and drove it home with a great big sledgehammer. So, the sort of our relationship with progress and optimism and then disappointment, to extend your comparison further, does have a reference now. You're absolutely right. The internet is just like the printing press, isn't it? It's just another zippier, faster way of disseminating information around. And I should imagine there were people who were wedded to the oral tradition who looked at a piece of parchment and thought, what no one will be able to remember anything, you're losing the essence of the communication knowledge. But of course we can see what the printing press and what reading has really done for us. Incidentally, I don't think that conversation quite ever took place like that. But passing of traditions is quite slow, and it doesn't tend to bring out the sort of Monty Python's vignette. but nonetheless, there is part of us that is deserved by losing the oral tradition, and I feel that obviously 100 years on, it's not something that bothers me day to day. But I am reminded of what is lost when I get in the car and I can't find my way to the corner shop without sat nav. That tells you something about abdication to technology in remembering things and taking decisions for you. And I'm sure that if you went back 600 years, you find people are much better at remembering things when they're told, because they didn't have any other option. And it's a habit. so yes, of course, these evolutions of technology have really brought us on, haven't they? And what you can do with digital is completely extraordinary. I mean, it's fantastic. There's a very good program on it's on Netflix, and it's called The Social Dilemma, and it's about social media, and it's amazingly balanced, and it's very diligent in its assessment and criticism of social media, particularly with its impact on young people and how ruined they are by overexposure. But even the most staunch critics of it still point out, but isn't it marvelous that I can find my way around, I can get materials, I can look things up, I can research the world, I can understand it, I can have something delivered, I can get a car to come to my door just like that, or wherever I'm standing. So that's all brilliant. And so yes, to an extent, the internet does provide us with this fantastic enlightenment vehicle, the encyclopedia of all things. Encyclopedia, there's a big enlightenment idea. Well, Google is the ultimate encyclopedia, isn't it? I mean, imagine what Diderot and D'Alembert would have thought if they'd seen that. They say, that's what we wanted to do. And they say, yes, but you don't write it yourself. You see, you write an algorithm. They wouldn't. They would have marveled at that. And then you can imagine Descartes listening and saying, "Told you it was all in maths." So you can sort of see how the internet is this kind of natural progression in the evolution of science and the way we live. On the other hand, it still has loads of stuff which is utterly awful, isn't it? Right? Doesn't it? I mean, there have been lots of awful things peddled around in books. David Copperfield is a book, so is Mein Kampf. And yes, we can run OAE player, and people can watch fabulous recordings of the OAE for a really affordable subscription in beautiful 4K. On the other hand, you can listen to Donald Trump yet again lying about his election. So, and using social media, this, as you say, democratizing force to give a huge sort of scary weight to lots and lots of people who are prepared to believe absolute rubbish. And there's always been a problem. And so do I think we're in a golden age? I think probably it's the same. But I do think that, and that's in a way what sort of reassures me, because it's the same, and we're the same sorts of beings, and we are working with upgraded, advanced, but ultimately equivalent tools. There's always been a downside to science. First you invent anything, someone will find a way to throw it at another person and hurt them. So I sort of see it as being
a great example of the guilt of Nobel in creating dynamite.
Of course, exactly. And there are so many on there. I mean, there's that wonderful Dürrenmatt play Die Physiker, which is all of, and Brecht went on about it in Das Leben des Galilei. Rather unkindly pointed the finger at Galileo for recanting in front of the Catholic Church, and the last scene of the drama, you see mushroom clouds in the back, and Brecht saying, "See, if you give in, that's what happens." And State and Science Park Company Public and Science Park Company, the state clamps onto it, and then you get this sort of, horrendous tyranny of ignorance, of knowledge and power over ignorance. There's always been this tension, and I think actually it's wise not to think that you're over it. Someone once asked, there are times when you have bad days, and when Trump was elected, someone said, "What do you think of that?" And I said, "It's the end of the Age of Enlightenment." And it's not, is it? Of course it's not. No one man is. It's just the same struggle. It's just got different colours and different props.
Very true. Well, it's, I think, fascinating some of the things you've said in there. I'm going to build on two of them. One around our conversation on democratization of content, and two, one thing you very effortlessly slipped in. So applying all those democratization things to orchestras.
It was a crude plot.
Wonderful. It was effortlessly just segued in halfway through. But if before, as an orchestra in the 1980s or the 1990s, and even early 2000s, if you wanted any large-scale media coverage and large-scale audiences, you'd need to be on radio or television. And to do that, you'd need to go through huge gatekeepers to get through the BBC, very few people, get to commissioning editors. The process is very long and complicated, which is not necessarily an innate fault of the BBC, but that's the procedure to go through. And then sort of say 5-10 years ago, we have stuff like the Berlin Phil Concert Hall. And with respect to the OAE, I guess their budget is a little bit bigger than yours. So they have, because they have all these resources, they can do this. Marginally bigger. But because they have these resources, they can build this digital console and have these videographers and various things. We're now in a period where we have this democratization. Consumer technology is incredible, so we can now compete. And this has opened up new doors. So, for example, OAE Player is something that, in essence, means you have the option to broadcast and connect people on a global scale with hypothetical and limited attention. What benefits do you see of being able to have something like OEE Player and not having to necessarily have gatekeepers, etc.? I'm not necessarily saying BBC and to go off on a rant unless you're so inclined.
Well, from the player's point of view, it's marvellous. I mean, sure, we will not mention the C word. We're not talking about COVID, but it's an avenue of necessity at the moment, isn't it? Because you can either play in a closed room with no public, or you can film it. So that's one thing. But if we put that to one side, because COVID will pass, it will be over eventually. What else? I do think it's a peculiar kind of democratization. Yes, it is. It's the same we were talking about before. It puts fabulous tools in the hands of your average individual rather than the specialist in a large organization. And so you're absolutely right. There once was a time where if you wanted to have anything that was audio visual, you would need a whole phalanx of professionals and an enormous investment to make it possible. And now you don't. I think that's been true of, we've known that in, for example, the pop industry, that a teenager in his bedroom can produce a hit just using, well, I mean, I won't hesitate to say GarageBand, but a lot of them can use Pro Tools, so they can just knock things together and out it comes, and it's done. And the days of, hacking away and multi-tracking and smoking goodness knows what for days on end to produce a track in Abbey Road, well, they aren't the only way anymore. I think it's a good thing. I don't think there's any question it's a good thing. But I don't think that you can ever make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. So it doesn't matter what tools you have. It doesn't matter, how many buttons you can press or what you can do on your own. I think the responsibility still rests ultimately with the quality of your creative expression. If you're an artist, how can it not? So I was talking about this with Jonathan Cohen that I worked on with when we did worked with when we worked on Archangelo together and developed it, and we made a lot of recordings. In fact, that was our MO. We developed that organization by making one recording after another, and that's what we did, and it worked. And I asked him about whether we had done a good thing. I mean, obviously it was great music and I liked it, but I said, have we done a good thing? Because the phonographic industry does certain things which are not the same as live performance. Now, Archangelo could play very well live, so I'm not concerned about that so much. But when you go into a phonographic process, there are lots of buttons that you can press, and these days they are brilliant buttons. I mean, I remember once I did this at the end of a take in the B minor mass. I dropped my pencil on the desk and it echoed around the church like this, and it made a huge noise. And then Johnny turned around and said, "Who did that?" And then someone came out of the recording booth and said, "Was it you?" And I said, "Yes." And they took me in and they just dragged a mouse across the screen, pressed a button, and then boom, and you saw this rogue noise just disappear completely from the wave profile. And you had a pure and perfect recording. There are almost no limits to the magic that they can perform when doing that work. So you ask the question, is that what's the connection between that and art, really? If you can, if a singer can sing 18 bars of Berlioz without breathing, or a pianist can play both books of the Etudes without dropping a note, are we fibbing too much? So we've got all these tools and everyone can use them now. Where does that take us? And Johnny pulled me up, as he often does, and he said, "Look, you know as well as I do, if you go into a recording as a kind of unprepared sort of ensemble, you'll get at best an unprepared sort of okay recording. You can't make a brilliant recording out of a bunch of players who don't like playing together, haven't rehearsed or haven't learned the notes. You just can't do it. It's not a doable thing." So whilst the buttons are all around us and the infrastructure is all around us and all the tools are there, I think that's just the same as saying, well, everyone's got a chitarrone, or everyone's got a theorbo, or everyone's got a violin. Everyone's pretty much doing the same thing as they did before. They've all got the same gear, or they've all got equivalent gear, or they've got gear that they can use. And it ends up just being the same old thing. The the noble contest of creativity and artistic instinct. And I think that the buttons that we have around us, they're great fun, and it's wonderful. You know, it's talking about what you can do with new over-the-top software applications and the tricks you can pull with them. That's all brilliant. Fun and games, I love it. I've got a PlayStation, great. But that's never going to make the recording of, I don't know, Orfeo, where that moment where the messaggero meets Orfeo and says, look, I'm really sorry, I've got some bad news. That moment where the messenger gets shot, and it's that great moment in Monteverdi's opera. You're never going to make that work unless you've thought about it and you play it well. And so that abiding, glorious challenge is the same and should never be distracted by anything else. That's what we're all doing.
Very true. And I think it's one of those things where content can't be replaced in a way. All this technology and gadgets and things can only enhance or support or facilitate. It doesn't make up for the shortcomings of poor content at any point.
No, it need not. But what I do think it can do is when you realize you've got these things, oh my goodness me, the dimensions that you may be able to give to the performance. I mean, look, I mean, we're used to this. When you go to great operatic production, great theatrical production, for example, you see what people can come up with. If you had one of the best things still that I have ever seen, and I don't say this because it's the OAE, because I was a student when it was done. I had nothing to do with it. But the OAE did that production of Theodora, Peter Sellers' Theodora at Glyndebourne. And it is still one of the best things that I have ever seen. And I really, although I was used to opera and I liked it, I wasn't wedded to it. I wasn't embedded. It wasn't the only thing in my life. And I remember going to see it when Glyndebourne Tour came to Manchester and being totally overwhelmed by the depth of imagination and the truth of it. And who would have thought that Chaconne could be presented with two people on a gurney taking a lethal injection, and that you could do that with the oscilloscopes and the beat of the music? I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, they had oscilloscopes, they had the machine that goes beep, and they had all sorts of ideas, but it took that leap of brilliant imagination to have the Romans as orange-clad sort of American stormtroopers and have a Clinton-esque guy, you know, swashbuckling on Diocletian's fatal day, at the front of everyone, in front of a press corps. I mean, it was genius. And then that sort of fantastic, performances of Irene and of course of Theodora, these sylph-like, gorgeous, unstained examples of virtue. I mean, it was one of the most riveting things I have ever seen. And
very true.
Although it did use bangs and whistles, it used things which were iconoclastic, it used things which were strident, modern, and relied on gift of ability, technically. But ultimately, it came from the right place, which was just brilliant thought.
Very true. And I think one thing that really fascinates me is seeing how the fact we can do all of this and we can be supported is now allowing us to experiment and go beyond what we were potentially doing before in various circumstances. So I generally have a criticism of traditional broadcasts of orchestra concerts, and as you said before, potentially just filming things quite flat of an orchestra on a stage, and it's not particularly nicely colour graded in various bits. And then you look at what the Philharmonia have done recently, and it looks absolutely visually beautiful and way better than I've seen any other broadcasting television company do in both the UK and further afield. So it's interesting to see that we can now start having these experiments and go forwards. One thing I'm really interested to ask you now, we're going to go on to the C word slightly as we finish off and sort of predictions for the future, is that obviously you've now been creating, in essence, a broadcasting media organisation as well as an orchestra in creating OAE Player, which, unlike other orchestras who decide to launch with one concert in their digital season, you launched with, I think it was 23 or something quite significant. What challenges have you faced in creating this, and what have you learned in now becoming a digital broadcasting orchestra, in effect?
That's a good question. I think the biggest challenge actually is the process for the players, what it does to them, what it does for them. I talked about the phonographic industry and the way that works. Typically, unless it's a BBC recording, typically, you go in I'm sure everyone knows how this works, but for the benefit of those who don't, you go in, you do a whole take, maybe another couple. Then you break it down, you start doing patches, and you do little bits again and again, and you have a producer who says, oh, can we just have another go at 17, a little bit light on the violas, and you just keep patching things up until eventually you have a whole tin of buttons and you can sew them together and you can produce the end result. The very interesting thing when you're doing audiovisual, of course, you can do that even with video. It's just a lot harder. It's very time consuming, and there is a trade-off, isn't there? Because whilst you might have the technical capacity to do it, the video is linked to the audio in such a way that you can't separate them and then patch in something else without there being an evident disparity. And what you might be able to normalize with tricks to the ear, it's a bit harder when you're stitching together video as well. Now, I qualify that by saying that the limits of technology are so high that if you really were determined, you could probably pull off anything you liked if you really tried. But within the normal compass of practical work, and bear in mind that a typical phonographic process from recording to release is never shorter than a few months. If you really want to get through repertoire and get it out there, you have to take it differently. So what you find you end up doing, I think, is asking players to play things entirely, to go all the way through, listen to that, think about it. If they like it, we keep it. If they don't like it, they decide what it is, and then they record it again. And you have whole takes. And that integrity of approach is a new thing. It doesn't necessarily produce perfection because it's still a performance. And then there's a challenge for the players afterwards because they think, well, we would be very happy with that as a performance. We really liked what happened. Wasn't completely phonographic perfect, that A flat's a bit out and that entry wasn't quite right, but we'll leave it. So things you might have fixed as just audio before, you're leaving in place. And then, of course, there's the burden that this artifact may be repeatedly heard. And then, of course, people will think, yes, I've noticed that now. And so they gradually, in repeat hearings, they may notice flaws. And that is a very significant challenge. You can notice flaws, by the way, listening to audio recordings. Of course you can. There are lots of things on the show, very distinguished records, where there are things which aren't quite right. It doesn't matter. But it matters to players sometimes when they think that something like that is going to go out. But I think one silver lining here is that the approach of integrity, in other words, going all the way through, let's just give people an artifact of performance, which is what they're missing in COVID. Let's give them that and present it honestly. I do think there are things that you get. You get a chemistry and an observable energy between players which cannot be represented if it's from multiple takes. There is a psychology. It's like that Malcolm Sargent thing. He was fabled to have heard the last bars as he began conducting the first, and that was his approach. Great conductors, they do know where it's going to land even before they start. They have a sense of the whole integrity. Well, if you have something you give people in this spanking new 4K medium, but has that connection with the original concept, that the players are taking you with them all the way through one concept of performance, without interruption, without adulteration, without messing about, I think that's exciting. But it is a challenge. It's a really big challenge when you embrace digital in this way. I think it's the biggest one. All the other things, like how to do good camera work, well, buy better cameras, get better lenses, have motorized lenses, have dollies, have gimbals, all of that stuff. Who cares? Just use it, and you float around, you give people panoramic shots, and you develop a vocabulary of where you shoot. That's wonderful. But that fundamental artistic integrity is the thing that really interests me. That's the thing that's a departure. We're used to it with the proms, of course.
Very true, and I think it's a wonderful sort of theme to start tying things up on. But before we do, I'm going to ask you to delve into your crystal ball. And considering that most of us can't see what's happening later that day, that could be quite a tricky question. But what do you see the future potential for orchestras being now that we have all these potential tools and consumer technology can help them connect around the world? What do you think our landscape is going to look like in 10, 20 years? You could be a very rich man if you've got a good answer for this.
You'd never be a rich man running an orchestra. I don't think that people will ever tire of listening to a nice tune. I don't think they'll ever tire of, I've said it before, of being told a story. And I don't think they'll ever tire of getting together. So they're age old. And I don't think it really matters terribly much what technology in the end is used to achieve those things. It could be singing a song and telling a story and having a drink around a fire in a field at night. It could be wearing an Oculus Rift and being completely immersed, with no light bleed and perfect binaural sound recording, and then being lost in a wonderful universe of the Rite of Spring or whatever it is that you wanted to do. Or it could be catching something on a YouTube film, or it could be just going to, well, God forbid, going to a concert and just sitting in a seat and listening to some people on stage performing. I don't think it ultimately matters terribly much what the technology is. And there's this sense that if technology keeps going, everything else goes with it. Well, I'll still chew my food very much the same way as I used to before the internet appeared. Right? It's not changed that. And actually, my intestines don't really work differently as a result of the Ryzen 9 chip and however many multi-threaded cores it's got. It's not made any difference to the way in which my anatomy works. So I think, rather in the way in which we look back at time and we said, is it a new golden age? And I'm no mean disparaging anybody who thinks it is, but I see it as a continuity, really. It's the more it changes, the more it stays the same. Plus ça change. And I think it will be like that in the future. And yes, the only thing I would perhaps pause on is if they really do that Black Mirror thing where you can put a button in your head and you are absolutely there. Well, that's a bit of that is a kind of whole paradigm shift, isn't it? But until then, and maybe actually we will discover, even if you cross the threshold and go into the other universe, still the same thing. It's still lungs, hearts, guts, and soul and brain. So whether it's sung, whether it's written, whether it's gestured, whether it's in 4K or it's grainy old black and white, I think it's the human core of it which is consistent. And as long as we focus on that, my three things in terms of performance, beautiful sounds and a great story and contact with others. Not beautiful sounds. Sounds that engage and a story and contact with others. I think that really 20 years on, we should expect to see that working very well, so long as we're still human beings. And it hasn't been the singularity. We haven't all been exterminated and turned into apps or widgets.
I think that's a wonderful point to end on. So if anyone's wanted to see some of the things that you're doing really creatively online, either with the OAE player or with Dark Universe and Everything, for example, where can they find that? So this is definitely the shameless plug time. You can say whatever you want.
Oh, thank you very much. You can get to OAE player through the OAE website, and you're very welcome. We're very proud of it. We are investing heavily in it and expanding hugely, and particularly I'm proud of the players and what they put into it. I think it really does have their heart and soul, which is what I wanted in the first place. So I'm very pleased. Thank you for that plug.
Absolute pleasure. And the OAE website is oae.co.uk as well.
It is indeed. Which is what you asked.
Not a problem at all. But thank you so much for either watching live or listening back. As always, all the episodes are on the website, and do feel free to reach out on social media. And the website is david-taylor.org for my shameless plug as well. And so the podcast is available on all general places where podcasts are. So thank you so much for joining me, Crispin. It's been a real pleasure. It's fantastic to have you here. And thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Cheerio. Bye.